In our timeline, at least in the early years, the Axis had such good luck, it's not even funny. At basically any turn where their enemies could have stopped them, they failed to do so. When Germany remilitarized, they let them. When Germany sent forces into the Rhineland, they let them. Austria, Spain, Albania, the Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia, at quite literally every turn, the West turned a blind eye to the rise of the Axis. Even when war did seriously break out, the Allies barely fought instead of attempting a quick breakthrough of weak German lines in the West. Even during military operations thought up by drug-fueled generals, the Allies did exactly as the Germans hoped, allowing for a German conquest of France in a frankly insane amount of time. Now, Japan was slightly less lucky than Germany, as the West simply cared a lot less about the Japanese invasion of China. Still, just after a war-hungry, militarist government took shape in the nation, Germany happened to conquer all of Europe, leaving the European colonies in Asia very open to Japanese invasion, allowing their insane conquests as well. So today, I want to reverse the Axis' luck, with every move they attempt to make backfiring in their face, though, hopefully, still keeping each step as realistic as possible. Also, while an easy solution would be to say, democracy survives, yay, this is a rather boring outcome. I want to see the horrific regimes attempt but fail in all of their goals. Alternatively, you can also say that things already went terrible for the Axis, considering, they lost. But come on, I couldn't just repeat real history in a terrible episode, right? Finally, I have attempted to limit French and British direct intervention as much as possible. Of course, a military invasion of Germany would be rather terrible for the nation, but it's far more interesting if we allow the West to win through diplomatic means. With that, we can dive in. While we can start as early as 1922 and start messing around with Italy, which we will do later, for the most part that isn't necessary. The first major change we can make has to do with the remilitarization of Germany. Upon coming to power, Germany attempted to hide this process, for example, by pretending that tanks were tractors, and hiding government debt and spending behind shell companies. Despite this though, obviously, France and Britain caught on relatively quickly, yet in our timeline decided to do nothing. Poland though had different plans. Marshal Pilsudski argued to France that they should launch an intervention against Germany now. France refused and nothing happens. Yet, let's assume that Poland, on their own, invades Germany anyways. Germany's lacking army in 1934 couldn't hold back Poland's larger army. Now I highly doubt that Europe would allow Poland to march on Berlin, and eventually a six-nation conference, importantly also including the Soviet Union, meet up to discuss the fate of Germany. Don't expect any major border changes, aside from some minor border corrections, and perhaps increased Polish authority over Danzig. The real focus is on Germany, as a new militarization pact is agreed upon. Germany's army, and even air force and navy, is allowed to grow, but there are still clear restrictions on it, now backed by Polish guns and guarantees from London, Paris, Rome, and Moscow. All of this is already a big blow to German plans, but not all is yet lost. While direct military action, for now, remains out of the question, the German government begins to look at more covert manners of rejuvenation. Their eye now wanders to Austria, beginning to put more serious pressure on the nation for unification. This would spur on a diplomatic spat between Italy and Germany, which would only escalate and escalate, causing the new Austrian government to seek protection and alliance with the Italians. Seeing German actions over Austria, which just like in our timeline, included assassinations and attempts of coupping the government, Italy and France grow closer together as an anti-German alliance begins to take shape. This leads us to 1935. A little-known German annexation in the interwar period was the small Saarland in the west. The territory had been split away after World War I to be put under temporary League of Nations control. Now, in 1935, 15 years after the territory was split away, a vote was to be held over reunification. For the German regime, this would now become a major point of pride. Now likely, even if they did absolutely nothing, the region would vote to rejoin Germany. Yet still, the German government resorted to horrible measures to ensure their victory. Imagine kidnappings, assassinations, intimidations, and spying from the German side. In our timeline, they eventually stopped out of fear of French forces entering the region. In this timeline, we won't have this happen, and France, shocked by what is going on, indeed sends in the army and announces the referendum is postponed until a responsible government takes power in Germany again. The French action is controversial, but Italian and Polish backing makes it decisive. The Saarland would remain separate. By now, the Germans are getting desperate for a big show of force. At every turn, they have so far been halted by the Allies, and some form of victory was needed. Again, the Germans attempt to march into the Rhineland, something restricted by Versailles. Yet instead, French forces immediately respond from their positions in the Saarland. The Germans immediately withdraw again, and by this point, the losses are really putting a strain on the German regime. They had come to power, promising territorial expansion, military rejuvenation, and economic prosperity. So far, 2 of those goals had decisively failed, and without a debt-fueled military buildup, even on the economic side, the German economic miracle is being called into question. By now, army leadership is starting to seriously question the ability of the new regime. While all of that is going on, let's take a quick look at Italy. After World War I, Britain, France, and even Belgium partitioned the German colonial empire, leaving Italy with absolutely nothing. Over the course of the next 15 years, several territories were gradually added to the Italian empire to compensate. Yet, France and Britain didn't give these up willingly, wary of Italian ambitions. For example, Italy had invaded Greek Corfu in hopes of extracting concessions from Greece and the West. Here, I want Britain and France to take a much harsher stance on Italy. Not all too much would change, as the West and Italy still settle their border disputes and Italy gained some territory, though perhaps slightly less than in our timeline. More important though is the message that Italy needs Western approval for any expansion. This would rub Mussolini in the wrong way, but he has very little recourse. This would lead us to the well incident, where I want to place another change in the timeline. As Italy and Ethiopia were sorting out their borders, fire was exchanged between their armies and people died. In our timeline, cooler heads prevailed, until Italy launched an invasion of the nation a year later anyways. I will suggest that as a result of this incident, an unprepared Italy invades a year earlier in 1935, which makes Italy's early invasion even more incompetent than in our timeline. Hopefully, this time can be used wisely by the international community. The League of Nations, much like in our timeline, denounces the Italian actions. Unlike our timeline though, the economic sanctions placed on Italy are actually followed up on by France and Britain, further weakening the already pathetic Italian economy. Furthermore, this additional time allows for limited British support for Ethiopia, but also, perhaps surprisingly, German support for the Ethiopians. This isn't unrealistic, as this support also happened in our timeline, as it was hoped by Germany that Italy would give up on Austria in exchange for Ethiopia. After about a year of conflict, Italy has obviously gained the upper hand, yet the war is far from as easy as hoped. Italy is further shocked by the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War, with it being quite unclear how long the Ethiopian War would continue on for. Italy's army being involved there would start to undermine the far more important goals of supporting the nationalists' victory in the Spanish Civil War, which, it was hoped, would create a new Italian ally in the region. Italy enters negotiations with France and Britain, still gaining a big chunk of Ethiopia, but the remnants are consolidated under British protection. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all the latest releases, consider doing so. Thank you. While all of this was happening, Germany would still attempt to get Italy to join their plans for European hegemony. Yet, compromise wasn't in the German vocabulary. The matters of Austria and German support for Ethiopia might have been solved by more competent diplomats, but the Germans completely refused to renounce their interest over Tyrol and Istria. The best assurance that Germany could come up with regarding Tyrol was, "Whatever will be, which weren't the most reassuring words from what would become a new, militaristic and nationalistic neighbor. From Rome's perspective, after giving up Austria, what is stopping Germany from falling in with Paris and London and going after Italy instead? While France and Britain were annoying, at least they weren't planning on the conquest of Italian territories. It was decided Berlin would not be a good ally. This leaves the focus on the Spanish Civil War. The League of Nations, by now a mere Franco-British puppet, doesn't disallow intervention into the war like in our timeline, realizing how this may only increase tensions with Germany and Italy. Instead, France and Britain officially recognize the Republican government as it expands into a far greater proxy conflict than in our timeline. Importantly, the Spanish gold reserves are relocated to France, who despite fears of internal turmoil, decide to support the Republicans as much as they can. The gold is used to purchase weapons from France and indirectly Britain, which bolsters the Republican side of the war. More importantly, and I won't bore you too much with the details on the side of the Spanish Civil War, the various factions in Republican Spain work together better. Most importantly, by keeping the communists out of power, as instead the Social Democrats and anarcho-syndicalists dominate the Republican side. The war drags on for years, with very little success for either side. But worse for Franco, the Germans stopped supplying the nationalists with resources out of fears that they were just propping up a future Italian ally. Italy continues to send a frankly ridiculous amount of resources to Iberia, yet Germany has other plans. With Italy and the West distracted in Spain, a new attempt is launched to take control over Austria, including another coup and German forces entering the state. Italy immediately responds with their own counter-invasion, as soon Austria is split between pro-German and pro-Italian elements, as the devastating Austrian Civil War takes shape. France and Britain are happy to allow their enemies to fight each other, and they barely intervene. With the ultranationalists now distracted elsewhere, France manages to assist the Republicans in Spain to an eventual victory, after 6 years of devastating brother-on-brother warfare. Taking a quick break from Europe, over in Asia, our path to Japanese failure is far easier. While we could insert earlier Chinese and Western intervention over Japanese expansion, this isn't very realistic because frankly, the West didn't really care too much, and China just wasn't in a position to resist. Of course, we can have China do far better in their military management, but aside from minor adjustments, there is little we can do to change the Japan-China dynamic too much. Yet, we have a great power available that is currently not involved in the goings-on of Europe and is not in a position to expand their power in Europe without upsetting the West, something that Stalin wanted to avoid for now. Yet the war in China presents an interesting opportunity to directly and indirectly expand Soviet control over the region. Much like in our timeline, the Soviets would be the biggest allies of the Chinese initially, and Japan would notice. There were big proponents in Japan, even in our timeline, for a war against the Soviets. This war was basically expected by both sides until 1941, when they signed a non-aggression pact. Yet, that pact was signed at a time when Europe was basically German, and Japan could start influencing French Indochina. With this new reality, a potential southern push against the currently weak European colonizers seemed like a great plan. That is not the case in this alternate timeline, and so I suggest that the Japanese remain focused on attacking the Soviet Union, who they see as the sole reason that China wasn't under their control yet. Much like in our timeline, Japan starts a series of border conflicts, half hoping to just bully the Soviets away from assisting China. This is not what happens. Rather, with the complete lack of a European threat for the moment, Stalin decides to declare war on Japan. The Soviet-Japanese War is a reality. The war starts off as an embarrassment for the Soviets, as the Japanese very much seize the initiative. Yet, the Soviets have a couple of advantages. From the west, reinforcements are coming fast. The Soviet Air Force, and especially Tank Corps, enjoys a far greater industrial backing than Japan can ever hope to muster. Besides, basically all of the Soviet factories and resources are completely safe from Japan, even if we assume a crazy degree of Japanese success initially. Much like during our timeline's Japanese-American War, Japan has a couple of months to run crazy, but then they have to contend with the fact that they attacked a nation that is more populous and industrious than themselves, while also still failing to contend with the Chinese at the same time. The only thing that Japan has going for them is that the Western powers will continue to supply them and potentially even slightly aid them in this conflict, hoping for a weakening of the communists. That is basically it though, and especially with Europe still quite tense, Britain nor France would fully join Japan against the Soviets. Especially not until Japan departs China first, which they will never do. Don't count on American intervention either. While probably also sympathetic to Japan, there is no way that any American government would manage to fully side with them. Which means that long term, Japan has no chance. The war lasts for years and is destructive for both sides, yet the victor became clear after the first year. Japan's costly and great navy is practically useless, just depleting their already limited resources, as eventually the Soviets managed to push the Japanese out of China. It is possible that the West intervenes here to prevent a communist Korea, but considering that this is a what if everything went terrible, let's assume that they don't. The Japanese are thrown from the continent and the nation is in disarray. Eventually, Hirohito forces some form of peace talks, after months or even years of Soviet bombings, especially on Japanese naval targets, very slowly closing the naval gap between the two nations. In the peace deal, southern Sakhalin is lost and Japan leaves all of China except for Taiwan. Korea too is split away and officially turned into a Soviet puppet state. China itself can go two ways. Either the Soviets transfer their control to the communists, leading to a large, unified communist China like in our timeline, or the Soviets support a coalition government in China, leading to a large, nationalist China. Either way, Japanese ambitions have been decisively squashed. This leads us back to Europe, where the Germans are still in their military struggle. While Germany's army is smaller than the Italian one, it is far more modern and better led, allowing them to slowly but steadily get the upper hand in the conflict. But it would take the Germans more than a year before their control over Austria was basically secure. At this point though, they made their major mistake. The West had warned against Germany officially unifying with Austria or invading Italy itself. Yet, a bolstered Germany did both anyways. In response, France entered the still demilitarized Rhineland in an attempt to get Germany to back down. Germany now had no chances of victory, and they would be forced to again listen to international arbitration. The Germans once again leave Austria, which France put in their protection to prevent further Italo-German conflicts over it. In exchange, Germany would finally be allowed to remilitarize the Rhineland. Yay! Once again, German plans for expansion were ruined. Around here is where I'll end the scenario. Italy, while still intact, has been practically bankrupted in the past few years, fighting for limited parts of Ethiopia, spending billions on supplying the nationalists in Spain, who then lost anyway, after which they fought a devastating war against Germany, gaining nothing from it in the process. Internal factions within Italy are seriously considering replacing Il Duce and restoring a more monarchist and perhaps even democratic Italian state. Germany is not doing better. Their economy is running on fumes by this point, and the costly war with Italy ended with nothing gained. The French have managed to maintain a strong anti-German alliance surrounding them, and hopes of expansion have mostly been stamped out. The German army has started secret talks with the Allies about ousting the ultranationalists from power in the nation, but even if the ultranationalists win this internal struggle, nobody seriously expects that France will ever sit idly by if the Germans attempt to expand again. Japan then has faced the worst fate. Not only were their dreams of empire squashed, it was done so by the communists, and not fully unfounded fears of a future communist invasion of the home island ensures that the nation remains in the grasp of the militarists, despite their economy having practically collapsed and international investments into the angry little great power having dried up. While Japan's powerful navy will probably prevent a communist invasion for the foreseeable future, not to mention Britain and America hinting at defending the islands should the Soviets try anything, Japan remains a shell of its former selves, and any dreams of empire or grandeur are squashed. And on that happy note, I will end the video here. Thank you all for watching, and consider leaving a like and a comment as well as subscribing. If you've enjoyed this video, click the video on top to watch another in this series. If you've already seen it, then I'm sure that the bottom video is great too. Once again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.